afternoon. In my talk today, I'm going to be focusing on the way in which, I suppose, a history of developments in South Africa's language policy is impacting on the language that we use in the foundation phase. It's a pretty simple approach, I think it's safe. I hope it's safe at least. And the reason why I chose this approach is because I think that language is and continues to be a major issue in how we teach various subjects, not only in the foundation phase, but in the intermediate and senior phase. So I've titled my talk, Rethinking the Fabric of the Foundation Phase. And I think this title speaks to the fact that language is so important, not only in the teaching of literacy, but in various other subjects, like life skills and mathematics and so on. And I begin my talk with what I consider to be an interesting idea about mathematics and its, I suppose, presence in the human mind. Developmental psychologists, particularly in America, are doing good work on early childhood learning and development. One crucial finding of theirs is that all children are naturally at birth equally equipped to excel at mathematics. The idea is that part of what makes us human is not only the ability to speak, or the ability to create culture, or the ability to use tools and technology, but also an innate ability to do maths. There's something about human beings that allows us naturally to analyze reality mathematically. So essentially, human beings are born with an equal and universal ability to do maths. It might well be part of our DNA. I can't say that it is. I haven't done that kind of research. But the thinking is that evolution has predisposed us to doing maths from birth. The FOXP2 gene, which was discovered by evolutionary biologists in England at the turn of the century, has been linked to the human ability to acquire language. It's not unique to our species, but evolutionary biologists do believe that this gene, the FOXP2 gene, allows us to speak. It's somehow linked to the vocal cords, to the structures in the brain that allow for the acquisition of language, for the learning of new languages, and so on. This suggests that our ability to speak is something that is part of our evolutionary makeup. Our brains are predisposed ultimately to facilitate the acquisition of language. In the future, not right now, we might well discover that there are genes that enable us to do things with numbers. With evolutionary biology as the point of departure, some developmental psychologists, Susan Carey in particular, have collected evidence showing that we have an innate predisposition to doing maths. What they would do to infants is, and they would do it to infants as young as 6 months old, they would expose them to what they call looking time experiments, where they would do a series of subtraction and addition sums with them using objects to record whether or not they were able to do the math. And ultimately what they would do is they would take, they would measure the length of, I suppose, looking at the solution to a problem, and basically to determine whether or not children were doing maths. And they were doing this with infants as young as 6 months old, and from this they begin to hypothesize that we have what is called a core cognition that is inborn in us. We have this ability ultimately to do things with numbers. As honeybees build their hives, naturally we analyze mathematically from birth. Research I'm presently involved in has shown that language has no effect on the ability of 7-year-olds to perform basic mathematical tasks that are the extension of what is referred to as core cognition. So we were fortunate enough to find a test that somehow accessed, I suspect, core cognition, or this natural ability to do maths. And we deployed this test in 3 different language groups and in different schools. And we analyzed the data in such a way to try and control for language. And we found that there were no significant differences between the different language groups. The tests were, sorry, I did not mention this, were translated into 3 different languages. And they were delivered in 3 different languages. So it seems at least that conceptually, 7-year-olds have more or less the same ability when it comes to doing maths. More or less, that's very important. They don't have the same ability, but more or less the same. So core cognition refers to the basic cognitive capacities we are born with. This includes the ability to discriminate between different sounds in language, the ability to tell the difference between red and blue, and the ability to recognize the difference between one object and two objects. The basic idea is that by the time the children go the world over, go to school, they all have a more or less similar ability to do maths. Between birth and grade 0, there's little instruction in mathematics. We very rarely actually teach our children how to do maths in the same way that we taught at school. We do it maybe through talk. We do it through trying to, I suppose, scaffold mathematical development using objects, reading to them, and maybe just interacting with them in a way that doesn't necessarily come across as being instructional. We ultimately play with them and try and develop their mathematical ability. So I say, while there's little instruction in maths between birth and grade 0, there should be little difference in the way in which children are able to do maths at grade 0. Okay? So there shouldn't be significant differences between children in Soweto doing mathematics and children in Finland doing mathematics. They shouldn't. We actually don't need to teach our children anything about maths before they go to school. Why then do our children perform so poorly in international standardized tests of mathematical and scientific ability? Our children go to school with more or less the same ability to excel at maths as Finnish children do, yet our performance on the terms, and my colleague will correct me if I'm wrong, ranks among the worst in the world. I believe that we have educated our children out of their ability to do maths because we lack a language policy that is aware of its own limitations regarding when children are immersed in English and how. Now before I begin, I must begin with a disclaimer. I am very sympathetic towards South Africa's current language policy. I think if I was a policy maker, I would probably write exactly the same policy. But pragmatically, I don't know if it's working. And that is my concern. And that is basically the topic of my discussion. So South Africa's policy in the post-apartheid era was born of a conflict not between the oppressor and the oppressed, in other words, not between Afrikaans and the African languages of our country, but between our ambition, in other words, our ambition to become a global player in the economy of the world, or in global markets, or in politics, in law, and so on, and our pride. Ultimately, we wanted to maintain the linguistic diversity of our country, while at the same time enriching our ability to communicate with people from other countries' language. The result is a language policy that tries to meet two demands: maintaining multilingualism and gaining access to global markets. And these include economic, epistemic, and political. This is Neville Alexander. He wrote this quote in 1999. Thanks particularly to the aura that still surrounds the heroic figure of Nelson Mandela, South Africa is simply one of the more prominent sites which illustrate the modalities of an international movement, i.e. the ever-expanding global hegemony of the English language and the apparently inexorable corollary, the marginalization of national, local, and regional languages. He proceeds to champion additive bilingualism as the optimal framework within which to guarantee that South Africa as a nation not only meets the indispensable need of ensuring that all our cultures are enriched, maintained, and developed, but also that we learn English to such an extent that we can ultimately communicate with people across the world. I don't know if additive bilingualism is working. So basically, our language policy is informed by two tensions, or by two poles. The one pole being globalization and its demands in our country, and this need to maintain multiculturalism, and the need to enrich the diversity of our country. And additive bilingualism ultimately tries to negotiate these two demands. It tries to negotiate the demands of multiculturalism and globalization. Additive bilingualism functions on the assumptions that it is possible to accelerate the acquisition of a second language by falling back on the mother tongue as a basis. This works in situations or in countries where languages are sufficiently related, both syntactically, grammatically, lexically, and so on. In other words, languages that share a common origin. It works, or there are more problems in a country like South Africa where languages are so different that it's very difficult to scaffold the learning of a second language based on a grammatical system that is totally different to the language that you're trying to acquire. So the problem with additive bilingualism and why it has not worked in South Africa, and this is debatable, is that this process works best in contexts where languages are sufficiently related grammatically, lexically, semantically, syntactically, and so on. Additive bilingualism works well in countries like America, where Spanish and English are ultimately the two languages that are trying to, I suppose, support each other in the acquisition of English. In Canada, where French and English are sufficiently related to allow for the acquisition of English or French on the basis of either one. And in Belgium, the language is also sufficiently related. I don't know if this approach is sustainable and whether or not it is working in South Africa. So basically, we use additive bilingualism in South Africa to accelerate the acquisition of English or Afrikaans on the basis of an Nguni, Sotho, or other Bantu language. Plainly speaking, the grammar of our European and African languages are continents apart. Can we afford to persist with this method? Specifically if it is not working? So, given that we are not using the right method, can we expect realistically that our children will succeed in acquiring English when they are introduced to it so late in their school in grade 1? When we first planned these sessions with David and Barbara and John Gilmore, we actually spoke about we suggested that it wouldn't be a good idea to actually speak about a curriculum. But maybe for the sake of illumination, I must explain that, and most of you will be aware that the first year of schooling, grade 0, is conducted basically in the mother tongue. And then in grade 1, we slowly start introducing English, which I think is way too late. We should be doing this much earlier on. And we should be immersing them in English at in a much more intensive way. We shouldn't be doing it for 2 or 3 hours a week. We should be doing it for 3 or 4 hours a day. If we want them to learn English to such an extent that they can adopt it as the language of learning and teaching in grade 4. I think we're doing ultimately too little too late in grade 1. So recent research shows that 6-month-old babies are best able, out of all human beings, to differentiate between the sounds of 2 dissimilar languages. From then on, there is a slow at first and steady decline in our ability to do this. Basically what psychologists did is they went and they exposed children to 2 different languages at 6 months. They measured, I don't know how they did this, but they measured the ability to recognize sounds in these 2 different languages. 3 months later, they did the same test, and they found that children are ultimately better able to recognize the language in which they're being spoken to, and not the language that they are being ultimately taught. Thereafter, of course, children are still better at learning a second language at the age of 3 than they would be at the age of 11. So the older we get, the worse we become at acquiring a new language. Yet we only begin to expose our children to what will become the language of teaching and learning when they're 7 years old. And only for about 3 to 4 hours a week at first, and then maybe 4 to 5 hours a week after that. So in grade 4, we expect our children to learn in a foreign language that they have barely acquired. This language is so different from the grammatical system that they have learned, that they've acquired at home and in the community. And yet we expect them to be learning in this from grade 4 onwards. So we suddenly begin to teach them maths and sciences and other subjects in English, and this leads to a catastrophe. Our children will spend the rest of their lives, or their time in school, trying to catch up and live up to what is an unrealistic, idealized expectation placed on them by a noble language policy that goes with it. I'm sympathetic, I say again, as I believe that the intention of our policymakers cannot be faulted. Unfortunately, I feel that the policy is not pragmatic. The other issue is this. I don't know whether or not English is necessarily the right way to go when we're teaching maths or science. Because it is a language that is so abstract and so metaphorical at times that when you're speaking about number, you can speak about two different things related to number. It's a very complex language to use for mathematics. And the other problem is that our indigenous languages, or the African languages of this country, have not been modernized. They have not been upgraded, which Prasa and Never Alexander back in the 90s said we must do. This was never done. We ultimately have allowed our languages to remain static while expecting them to meet the demands of a new kind of discourse, the scientific discourse, that they have not traditionally been developed or, I suppose, modeled to deal with. And to me, this is an issue. I think if we are going to go with mother tongue instruction, we need to spend billions of rands, which we can't afford because we don't have it, to update these languages, to make them more scientific, so that we can deal with mathematical concepts and scientific concepts in the language in which people are being taught. Either that's the one option. The other option is to immerse our kids, our learners, in English before they're even coming to school, before they're going to grade. Because we are ultimately pushing back and delaying their immersion in the language in which they are meant to be speaking scientifically.